So I'm going to talk to you about from geopolitics to GDPR, which will probably have quite a UK slant to it. And I mentioned this morning my beloved Canonical, which I joined 15 years ago and which sort of got me into open source. And I know Salim, who was on the panel with me this morning, because I used to chair an advisory board for the UN. And that experience at Canonical for me was really, really fundamental because I didn't really know what open source was. And I was a commercial technology lawyer who'd been brought into an organization to help them run the commercial side of it. They were wanting me to do deals. And before I knew it, I'd totally fallen in love with open source. And that was a complete, that was not on the horizon or on the agenda at all. And that's led me to do a number of different projects around open source since, including the work with the UN, until I'm now on the UK's Open Standards Boards, which sadly is not as taxing as it should be. We don't meet very often, something that we need to address. And this last year, I was elected. I stood for an election for the first time in my life, and it's not a very comfortable process, to be honest. I didn't particularly like being elected, but I was elected to the Open Source Initiatives Board. So I sit on that now as well. And I spend a lot of my time traveling around, speaking to people like this, during lockdown, mostly to my cat in my kitchen. And last year, so on Friday, I'm having 3 weeks holiday. I've not had a holiday in a year because last year we published this book. And it was a good idea at the time, 5 years ago, when we spec'd it. And we said, let's build this book. There'd been a first edition. I'd asked my professor who had edited the first edition to do the second one. And he said, no, you do it. So I thought, well, I'll go and do it then. But I hadn't realized what I was taking on. And we had 26 authors who did 24 chapters. And a lot of them are lawyers. It's, herding cats. So 5 years of work later, we published a 640-page book in October. And I have ADHD. And once it was completed and we'd edited the individual chapters, I had to read it 5 times from beginning to end. So I can tell you, if you really want to focus, it takes 4 days to read. But don't tell me if there are typos. Tell the publisher. I don't think I could cope with it. Now, the beauty of it, it's not that anybody's making money. So the only person who gets paid for this is me, and I don't care. And if you scan that barcode and you want to use it for non-commercial purposes, it's open access, and that was sponsored by the Veitch Foundation. So I think it's a really useful text, and we worked really hard to index it to try and make it something that would be, you would have real utility. I don't expect any of you to read it. We are giving some away tomorrow. We have 5 different book signings. I think one happened at lunchtime already. So on the 3rd floor, you can get copies of this if you want it. It's quite thick if you need to stand on something to reach a top shelf. And as you know from this morning, I lead Open UK. You probably didn't get a sense this morning quite how many people are regularly involved in Open UK as volunteers. So we normally have a staff of 2. We've gone to 6 to organise this conference, so we've had 3 or 4 people join us, not all full-time, but join us to organise this. And then everybody else is a volunteer, which is where my passive-aggressive behaviour comes out. But I've persuaded them to do all sorts of different things for us, and it works really well, and it brings the open technology communities in the UK together. And I've mentioned to you today that we're very focused on belonging. And we want to build a cohesive community with a voice. We have a community at our heart. We want to influence laws and policies. And we want to make the UK a great place to do open source. And this is what we were talking about a little bit this morning. Well, no, it's not actually. This is Oracle v. Google, which is something we responded to. We were part of an amicus brief with some other open source organizations a couple of years ago. I think we were the only non-US organization that engaged. And then we responded to the executive order when there was an opportunity post-publication for the consultation. So our remit is UK leadership, but global collaboration. So we keep an eye on what's going on. A lot of the figures people have been quoting comes from our reporting in 21 and 22. She was talking about the potential spend on open source software and the benefits back to the UK economy, to GDP. And we should have a report. We were hoping to get it out today, but it'll be out on Friday. It doesn't have an economic increase, but it does cover some of this. And we do a lot of work around sustainability. We actually have an event on the 15th of September at Dynamic Earth in Edinburgh. And we try to do something each year after COP26, because we did a major event at COP26, and we found a great alignment between open technology and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this year you will see, I think either later today or tomorrow, Chris Lloyd-Jones, who runs our blueprints now, talking about our EV charging blueprint, which is the second project. The first was a data center blueprint. And actually Open UK is going to take a much more active role in these blueprints. We think they're a great way of sharing information because we bring together software, hardware, data in a format that people can use. I'm stuck with it, sorry, I'm hooked to this. We bring it together in a format that people can use and learn from and keep adding to. And that's something that we want to do more of and encourage other people to pick up the blueprint template. So part of the reason we did a second one was that it allowed us to sort of show, do it once and then do it twice and show it's replicable. And I mentioned earlier today, learning is very, very important to us. And we did a couple of kids' camps. They're still available online and they're Creative Commons if anyone's interested. They're focused on Key Stage 3, filling in some of the gaps in education on open source software. And we got listed, which was a huge surprise to me last summer, as one of 8 notable open source software security initiatives, because we ran something called the Summer of Open Source Software. And it was a very long summer. It ran all the way through to Christmas in the end. But we had a mixture of sort of webinars, blogs, and podcasts that I think were quite good introductions to different aspects of security and that whole picture of curation that Eric and I were talking about earlier. So the title of this is Geopolitics to GDPR. And people are often surprised that I talk about things like economics or world affairs and open source in the same breath. I don't know about you, but my roaring 20s started the way I thought they might for a very short space of time. And I thought we were going to have quite an exciting decade. And Europe were heavily pushing their digital decade. Ursula von der Leyen had just appointed Marguerite Vestager. And I often quote this quote because I think it is really important. I think it's a really well-written piece. And she appoints Vestager, and when she does it, as she appoints her as the Digital Minister for Europe, she talks about stuff that applies anywhere in the world. And it's what I was challenging Mike on. I agree with what he said, but it's what I was challenging Mike on earlier, that sovereignty is an issue for every nation, every state, every country. And we have to find a balance between bringing sovereignty back to our own sovereign base and also continuing to be able to collaborate. And it's one of the spaces that I think geopolitics really impacts open source in. This is FOSDEM, which I didn't make last weekend, but this is FOSDEM in 2020. And I'm with colleagues from Open UK outside the Commission at midnight on the 31st of January. So everybody knows that FOSDEM is on the first Sunday in February. So we were there on, I think it was Friday the 31st or Saturday the 31st. And we were standing at the Commission at midnight and the lights went out. I don't know if they do that every night or if it was just for us for dramatic effect as we Brexited, but we were literally in front of the Commission building as it happened, standing in the dark. And I mention it, I don't care what your view on Brexit is, you don't care what mine is, it's not relevant. We are in a situation that we're now in, it's happened, and I mention it because that specific moment in time, it's not often you can point to a geopolitical act to the second. And very rare that it's going to happen before it does. So I think Brexit is a unique thing that impacted open source, and it did impact us. Personally, I and another person I know who had been asked to be directors of a foundation that was being set up in Europe were told we had to stand down because the Commission wouldn't fund if we were part of it. I saw other people who were contributing to open source projects finding that because of funding tied to the Commission, they had to step away. And I'm not blaming the Commission. I'm sure the UK did equally stupid things the other way around. But that geopolitical thing really matters. And when you see geopolitical shift and split, it doesn't work with collaborative technology. And we all need collaborative technology for the future. So it's sort of why I've talked about this quite a lot. Do anybody know what that is? So that's the Scottish variant of COVID. And you can tell it's coming because, frankly, you can hear it before you see it. And we couldn't see COVID coming, right? And it got all of us by surprise. And what that did was put us in a position where suddenly, as Eric said, a lot of open source came to the fore. We didn't, and it wasn't, well, it was partly Eric, but also Mike Bracken was talking about that. And part of the issue is that, well, it really frustrated me, actually, if I take a step back. when we looked at what was happening in March, April, May of 2020, we were all locked up in our houses scared, Singapore already had an open source app. Now, it might not have been perfect, but we could have taken it and we could have worked with it and we could have collaborated. But our governments didn't look that way. They looked at, not in my backyard, and started to create their own. And we missed a massive opportunity for all of us there that might have stopped us being locked up in our houses until our cats talked. And it's one of those things that, hindsight's a great thing, but we have to learn from. And we see, as Salim was saying about, the UN and the reactions to critical incidents or the reactions to wars and other crises, that we can't keep repeating this. We have to learn that we have to innovate collaboratively and avoid these geopolitical shifts. And in the UK, in the end, we did open source our app, second attempt, and we threw it over the wall. There was no collaboration around the contributions. Whereas if you looked at Germany, what we saw was, I think there were over 2,000 contributions from community in the way that they developed their app. And it was a lesson for us all to learn. And I mentioned in the title GDPR. So one of the things that we've seen is Schrems. Does anybody know what Schrems is? So Schrems 1 and Schrems 2. Schrems 1 was a lawyer's nightmare back when I was a lawyer, because we'd all relied on the way that we transferred data between the EU, which we were part of, and third countries. And we relied on being able to use model clauses. So that had already been set aside by Schrems, so it made a lawyer's job harder. This second case had the impact of saying that the US might not be a suitable place to transfer data to. Now, what that meant was you actually had to go in and audit, and that was a real act of aggression, not passive aggressive, very directly aggressive from the European Commission to the US. So we started to see through these roaring 20s, through things like GDPR, geopolitical shift happening. And we saw this focus on sovereignty. Open UK is a member of Gaia-X. We were one of the day one members, and we're one of only 2 day one members. And I know that, I think he's next door, Francesco Bonfiglioli, if I've got that pronounced properly, is CEO of Gaia-X, and he's talking at our conference. But what you see with Gaia-X is the actual business implementation of those political shifts and those legislative shifts and those court cases that we're looking at. So it wasn't just Europe, and it wasn't just Europe and the US. We also see Europe focusing on sovereignty and pushing back against China, the US pushing back against China, and the UK pushing back against China. And it's not just at government level. We see citizens taking to the street, protesting about Black Lives Matter. We see kids in Glasgow demonstrating in the streets at COP26. And by this time last year, maybe a month later, we see war. We see war in Ukraine, which at least for those of us from the UK really felt close to home. So why is this relevant? Well, I gave you my definition earlier. I assume some of you weren't in the room, but you've got a legal definition of open source, and it's where the source code is publicly available. You can inspect it, you can modify it, and where it's distributed on an open source license, which for me is an OSI approved license that meets the open source definition. And that definition talks about a borderless society. That definition talks about the ability to have everybody in the world, everybody on the planet use it, irrespective of where they're from or who they are. It talks about it being used for every use case, whether the use case is giving it to Russians when there's a war going on in Ukraine, whether the use case is commercial or non-commercial. And that's something that we have to hold very dear if we want open source to survive. That ability for it to be something global. Now, I talked this morning about shift, and I'm going to slightly repeat myself, but I think I have to, because there will be people who watch this and don't see the whole thing, the whole day. And I think we've seen a really big change in the last 5 to 10 years, because what we've seen is an adoption of open source at pace and scale, and that's happened for a number of different reasons, but the digitalization of all of our lives has been part of it. Now, I've lost my phone. If anybody finds it, oh no, I've got it. I do lose it quite a lot. This, 2008, was the first iPhone. I think 2008, later in the year, we got the first Android operating system. So you're looking at, what, 15 years? I don't know if you remember the first version of apps that were terrible, nobody used them. Now, if I want to do my laundry, I go into an app. If I want to move money, I go onto an app. If I want to listen to a book, I go onto an app. My whole life is dictated by that phone, which is why I worry when I lose it. And I also look for it when I'm talking to somebody on it, because it being a means of speaking to people isn't really what it's about for me. It's about using those apps. And some of those apps are open source, but actually what sits behind it, the infrastructure, is much, much more important. And that infrastructure that we touched on this morning, our national infrastructure, our national critical infrastructure, our enterprise infrastructure, that all serves this, which serves my life. And without all of that, my life wouldn't be as convenient, as easy, in some cases as fundamental as my friend Karen Sandler has a pacemaker which connects up to an app. In some people's cases it's life-defining. So the digital economy has changed our lives and it's elevated the engineer's role. Git, a bit older than 10 years, but what we see is Git allowing the collective, collaborative, public repositories like GitHub to really come into their own. Now, my friend Steve Wally just wandered into the room, and he's never heard me do this before, to my knowledge. So Stephen, there he's behind the pillar. So you can see how he's aged or not if you want to have a look. He's just peeking out from behind the pillar. Why should I be the only one? So this is Steve giving a keynote in 2018 at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit in Edinburgh. And he explains the journey that Microsoft has been on. And he talks about that journey, and he says that Microsoft has shifted from a stage where, every joke I knew about open source, the punchline was Microsoft. Steve Ballmer described open source as a cancer, to a stage where Satya Nadella is asking for us to look at today and the future. And Steve explains that journey on the basis of three things. First of all, anybody who's learned to code in the last 10, 15 years, they all work in an open source way. They use open source methodologies and they're used to using open source code. Secondly, customers today actually ask for open source because today, much of the innovation that you really want to use is only available open source. And thirdly, cloud. And I didn't really mention this morning, but the shift that we have seen to an infrastructure-based enterprise economy and personal economy, frankly, has had a huge amount to do with the success of open source software. And I think it's 13 minutes long, it's much quicker than I speak, but I think Steve's presentation is really worth listening to. Very quickly, I'll touch on a couple of other threats to open source. We've seen organizations that haven't really thought their business model through in advance or have had challenges with their business models where they distribute open source software. We've seen pushback, and we've seen pushback against the cloud companies. So this is a piece that was actually in the New York Times. It's not specifically about open source, but the content pretty much is. And they talk about strip mining. And strip mining, for my UK friends, is a US term. It comes from New York State, and it talks about stripping too much coal off the land and not leaving enough resources. And it's effectively what was being alleged by the founders of a number of open source companies. But the thing is, they weren't doing anything wrong. So we saw Shay Bannon, the founder of Elastic, writing about doubling down on open. And if you read that, you would think they were becoming more open source, when actually they moved away from an OSI-approved license, and they moved on to a license which allowed them to restrict commercialization. And even last year, we saw it again with Lightband. We also see challenges and threats, and I think Ian Mitchell QC is going to talk to you about this on the standards side, but we see challenges and threats coming from the telco sector, where I think something like 7 organisations hold 70% of the standards that are standard essential patents. But those standard essential patents challenge our ability to distribute open source software. Because if you have to have a patent travel with it, and it's royalty bearing, even if it's FRAND, you have a problem. And there's a problem with certain licenses, but there's also a whole sort of ecosystem problem. It just doesn't fit with what we do. And this is something that's going to need a lot more pushback, or we're going to see a redefinition of open source by the telco sectors. And they're actively out there doing that. They're actively out there promoting other licenses and spreading FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I've mentioned Ukraine. I've mentioned the issues that we've seen there with protestware. So again, this morning I talked about the value that open source generates. I've talked about our reporting. I've talked about how our legislature is looking at it and how COVID is impacting us. I've talked about security and the fact that we need to consider making sure that when we use open source software, as users, we implement it, we use good technical hygiene, good governance, or good curation, that we do that in a way that allows the software to be well maintained, well selected, safe, secure, whatever we need it to be. But we recognise that that burden does not sit with the open source community who are distributing the software. Another person who's in the room, I don't get to do this very often and actually say all these celebrities are in the room I'm talking in. So Eric Brewer wrote a piece for our State of Open report last year on curation, which I would recommend to you. It's not particularly long, it explains it beautifully, probably much better than I can. This I don't like so much. This was written by a staff member at Atlantic Council, and I think it was unwise. I certainly think the headline was attention grabbing for all the wrong reasons. But we see more and more focus from our legislator because we now have infrastructure and critical national infrastructure which is built on open source software. And suddenly everybody's aware. Suddenly everybody knows that we need to do something about this and ensure that that software is going to be secure so that the services delivered to our citizens are safe and secure. We talked about this morning. My personal belief, and something that I've written about for a long time, is that open source needs to be not recategorized, but given an additional respect and an additional category. So as well as being in the commons, it needs to be a digital public good. And we need to see that funded by international governments in a joined up way. So I'm hoping I've got us almost back on time. I'm taking Jen's slot and we can go into the panel, which I'm also moderating. I did say I didn't want to do all the speaking, but there we go. So I hope some of that's been useful to you. It's obviously recorded and I have gone very fast because I wanted to get through it in the time that I was allocated.